Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mindy Fashaw, COO of PackView, and I also lead our strategic consulting team. And I have with me today Matt McGrory, an account director on our strategic consulting team. This video today is a part of the PackView Approach to Ecom Strategy series. Today we're here to talk about how often you should be reviewing performance. So Matt, let's jump right in. How often should you be looking at performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that we get pretty much daily from our clients. And it comes down to a few different key areas. So I think one thing that you need to consider before answering that question is who is the audience and who will be reviewing the advertising performance and data. So a couple of different options. Are you a practitioner? Are you responsible for day-to-day execution and actual management? Or are you in a leadership position who may be responsible for things like decision-making, high-level decision-making, budget setting, even potentially staffing decisions? Or are you a cross-functional partner, someone on a team like sales or finance who may not necessarily be in charge of the execution or decision-making, but still definitely needs to have both input into the advertising strategy and then also access to the performance data?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we do know that how often someone should be reviewing performance now is tied to what they're really hoping to achieve as the outcome of their review. So Mindy, what do you think are some of the key goals that different audience members might have in mind when they're thinking about which areas they may want to review?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, just across the audience, I'll just talk in general. There's various things that someone could be looking to review when they're diving into, search and display data. So there's the basic, just kind of day-to-day check-in approach, and that would be things like, checking to see how you're pacing to your budget for the time period, looking at how sales and your efficiency metrics are trending for the week. Also looking at share of voice and share of shelf data. To see if there's any competitive changes that you may need to action. Maybe a competitor came in with a bunch more budget and they're winning top placements and you want to react to that. There's also the weekly, monthly, quarterly performance reviews. So that's really a bit more in-depth auditing and analyzing prior period performance, whatever period that is that you're looking at, and leveraging that information and those findings to inform key stakeholders of how you're performing against key objectives, and also to get their input and alignment on any proposed changes to strategy. And then lastly, I would say, there's kind of that deeper dive. So that review, and that can be used for many different things that you mentioned before, things like budgeting decisions, strategy changes. So kind of not tactical strategy, but maybe higher level company strategy changes, things like that. The timing of those deeper dives could be monthly, quarterly, it could be annually, or ad hoc. It really just depends on, again, to your point, what's the goal of the review? What are you looking to get out of it? And then the purpose, again, could be things like, at a higher level, changes to budget, staffing, strategy changes, talking about new platforms that are launching. We've seen a lot of that in the past, 15 months or so. It could be looking at getting buy-in where incremental budget might be required for things to test and learn. And again, reviewing changes in the competitive landscape. So seeing maybe emerging brands that you didn't see coming. We see a lot of that with 3P insurgent brands. They come in with high budgets. And so you might need to have an answer for that, and you might need leadership buy-in. And then, analyzing benchmarking across different platforms. So looking at, the various retailer platforms and how they're performing against one another, and or preparing for a retailer review. So there's lots of different ways and reasons why people would be diving into their performance data, with different goals in mind, and that will really inform the frequency at which they do that.
Got it. Okay.
Matt, can you give me an example of what types of things that a practitioner might be looking at and how often they should be reviewing those things?
Yeah, again, this is a really good question, and I think it does, again, depend on who you are within your organization or potentially a member of an external organization. So what I mean by that is the answer to that question depends on whether you are a brand partner who is managing a third-party agency relationship, or whether you are, either at an agency or a brand, the actual executor practitioner yourself. So if you are at a brand and you are managing a third-party outside agency that's executing on your behalf, I tend to recommend checking in and analyzing the data at least 1 to 2 times per week. I would say at a bare minimum, definitely ask for a weekly analysis, or sorry, weekly recap or weekly report, as well as just be having constant check-ins over the course of the week. On the flip side, if you are, whether at the agency or brand, and you're actually in charge of day-to-day execution and management, I recommend daily checking in on the data, at least on a daily level. And then especially during key drive periods like Prime Day, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, probably more like 3 to 5 times per day. As we know that e-com is not only fast-paced and competitive, but it's only getting more competitive and fast-paced as time goes by. And then last thing I'll say is it is tempting. I've seen this happen quite a bit, where if you do have a very robust SaaS or software solution similar to PackView, where you do have some level of automation or programmatic bid management, it can be tempting to not check in on the data as frequently because you assume that everything is just running smoothly in the background. So even if you do have a really powerful, strong SaaS solution, I still recommend auditing at least once a week, if not more frequently, mainly to just check to make sure that your automation settings are giving you the desired or intended outcome.
And Matt, I just thought of like just a funny little point of clarification here. So when you say, if you're a brand partner managing an agency relationship and to check in 1 to 2 times per week, their agency partner might not love you for saying that. Obviously, you have some bias, right? You're coming from the PackView perspective, where we have a tool that's fully transparent, where brands as well as agencies can log into the brand's account and check on the performance. So you're really referring to leveraging a tool like PackView, to check in on your own and not ask your agency partner for 1 to 2 check-ins per week, right?
That's a very good clarification. Please do not ask your agency for 1 to 2 check-ins per week. What I was referring to, like Mindy said, is if you do have access to the data or transparency to the data, definitely feel empowered to read and analyze and dig into that data yourself. Don't always rely on your agency partner, as strong as they may be, but mainly just feel like you're in charge of your own advertising data and you're knowledgeable, especially when you're going to get those ever-present leadership questions about why are we not winning slot 1 for this search term, which happens all the time. So
yeah, great. And Matt, just diving a little bit more into the practitioner, you did mention Prime Day and key drive periods. As we all know, Prime Day is fastly approaching. For Prime Day and other key drive periods, specifically, what types of KPIs do you recommend that practitioners are reviewing throughout the day?
Yes, this is another great question that we get all the time, usually leading into those key drive periods. And it does look pretty different than what you would normally analyze on a weekly basis or even a daily basis outside of the key drive periods. Reason being is that there's just such a massive influx of competition, and it's so hyper fast paced on those key drive period days. So I definitely recommend it focusing a lot on budgeting. So are you pacing appropriately over the course of the day? If you, let's say you have $10,000 to spend on Prime Day, have you already spent $8,000 by 8 a.m.? Just making sure that you're staying on top of how you're pacing and making sure that you're able to stay in budget for the biggest sales spikes over the course of the day. Same thing is keeping an eye on CPCs. Did you go into Prime Day saying I'm comfortable with a $5 CPC, but you're seeing $9 CPCs for your key items or key search terms? So making sure that you're not wasting money on inefficient clicks or impressions early on in the day. And then also just keeping an eye out for the competitive landscape. So making sure that you are winning top placements or keeping an eye on who is winning top placements for your key critical search terms. Making sure that you're tracking out of budget data, making sure that you are keeping an eye on promotions, so promotional ASINs. If you want to then go launch a midday new campaign to go target via product targeting those deal ASINs. So there's quite a bit that you can track on the day of the deal itself. And I would also pay attention to third-party other platforms. So if this is the Amazon as the example, keep an eye on what Walmart's doing, what Target's doing, because we do know that retailers have gotten a lot more savvy in the past few years at not only copying what Amazon is doing, but in some cases, proactively blowing up their pricing strategy the day before or the day of the deal.
Yeah, those are all great and very timely call outs with Prime Day coming.
And then going back to what a leader might care about when they're looking at this data, can you just give me an example of what types of things a person in a leadership position may be looking at? And then also how often someone in a leadership position should be digging into the data themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So, some of the key things that a leader might be looking for, and obviously it depends on the level of leadership, right? So I'm thinking more senior leadership. They might leverage these reviews to make overarching budgeting decisions. They might leverage it to make staffing decisions, right? So do they have the right staffing model? Should they insource, outsource, or take a hybrid approach, which is what you mentioned earlier, which is having that brand partner working directly with an agency. That's what we call a hybrid approach. And, the other things that they might be considering is, do we have the right tools? So, when it comes to actual execution of paid search, regardless of whether it's, the brand directly executing or an agency executing on the brand's behalf. At the end of the day, the space has gotten so competitive that you just can't compete without tools. So, do we have the right tools? And also, are the practitioners educated? Are they able to stay on top of all the different retailer platforms that are coming out, all of the new products, new features, functionality across some of the existing platforms? And how do you stay on top of that, right? So, when it goes back to some of those budgeting decisions, they're probably looking at things like what's working versus what's not. One of the biggest questions we get is, does the brand have sufficient budget? And that's somewhat subjective, right? And it's really about if your paid search is really optimized across all of your campaigns, meaning that you're driving really efficient performance for the outcomes that you're looking to achieve, and you are achieving those outcomes, then and you feel like you're still leaving room on the table, maybe you're running out of budget earlier in the day, then the answer would be no, you don't have sufficient budget. And so the frequency of these things can happen, at different cadences, depending on, the leader, how nimble the company is, and how able they are to make quick decisions and pivot. But really, what I did want to say is sometimes that hybrid model is the most effective, at least in the short term, while you're trying to figure out how to staff and how to keep your teams educated. Because, at the end of the day, it's really the agency's job to stay on top of, what's new and what the functionality is in the industry. And so leveraging that, but leveraging it to educate your teams along the way, can be key. So Matt, lastly, you mentioned cross-functional partners. What are some examples of cross-functional partners that may have an interest in reviewing retailer advertising data, and how frequently, might they be reviewing it?
Yeah, this one, it varies pretty widely, but I think it's really it's one that's not focused on quite as often, we tend to see. And so I would say there's a couple different answers. First, it's always going to vary by the size and sophistication of your company or your organization. But I'd say for a couple quick examples, teams like a brand or a trade marketing team, I think that's one of the more critical ones. The best answer I can give is just work with them proactively to align on a cadence and a strategy for how you're going to be sharing the data and giving them access to the data. Usually weekly tends to be a little bit too frequent in our experience, or in my experience. So I'd recommend somewhere in the monthly to quarterly level back to those brand and trade marketing teams. But then again, it's totally whatever works best for you and your organization. And then we do tend to see the best performance across all channels when there's just open data sharing and transparency across teams. So definitely encourage brands and agencies not to silo their data, to make sure that all their teams or all stakeholders have access to it, because it does tend to drive better performance across all channels. Some other examples would be teams like I mentioned earlier, like sales or finance or supply chain. Teams that may not necessarily be directly involved in advertising or marketing efforts, either digital or brick and mortar, but teams that do have some sort of vested interest in the advertising performance and then what implications that has on the business. So making sure that your teams like finance, like sales, especially supply chain right now during COVID craziness, are informed and in the loop, and then making sure that you're keeping them on top of any changes, any fluctuations in demand or profitability. And then again, the answer is whatever works best for you and your organization. Just make sure that there's very clear expectations and guidelines for how and when that's going to be shared. We tend to see monthly to quarterly with those teams is best, but then of course keeping them in the loop if there's anything crazy happening like we're currently seeing from the supply chain perspective.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Thanks for your time today, Matt. I hope everyone found this helpful. To follow along with the rest of the Ecom Strategy series, follow the PacView channel on YouTube. For more tips and tricks, visit pacview.com/blog. And finally, to learn how PacView's approach to strategic consulting can help your business, get in touch with us today.